You're a stain on this court and, frankly, a burden to the taxpayers." Judge Preston Whitaker sneered, his gavel poised like an executioner's axe. He didn't just see a woman in a simple charcoal blazer. He saw a target. He thought he could bury her with a $5,000 contempt fine for simply questioning his procedure. What he didn't know was that the woman he was trying to humiliate was the newly elected president of the State Bar Association. The very woman who held the power to dismantle his career. This isn't just a day in court. It's the day the predator becomes the prey. The air in Courtroom 4B of the Hamilton County Courthouse was thick with the scent of floor wax and stale coffee. It was a Tuesday morning, the kind of day where justice usually moved at the pace of a slow, drying coat of paint. Judge Preston Whitaker sat high upon his bench, his black robes billowing around him like a dark cloud. Whitaker was a man who enjoyed the honorable prefix a little too much. In his mind, the courtroom wasn't a place for the law. It was his private kingdom. At the defense table stood Cynthia Sterling. She was a woman of quiet presence, her dark skin glowing under the harsh fluorescent lights, her hair pulled back into a tight professional bun. She wasn't there as lead counsel today. She was there to provide pro bono support for a young woman named Cassie, a single mother facing an unjust eviction from a predatory landlord. Whitaker hadn't even looked at the motion Cynthia had filed. He was too busy looking at his watch. "Miss, whatever your name is," Whitaker barked, not bothering to look at the file. "This motion is frivolous. Your client hasn't paid rent in 3 months. The law is clear. Why are you wasting my time with these hardship excuses?" Cynthia stepped forward, her voice calm and measured. "Your Honor, if you look at Exhibit B, you will see that the landlord, Mr. Gregory Plimpton, refused to accept the emergency rental assistance checks. Under the current state statutes, he cannot proceed with an eviction while an application is pending. I am simply asking for a stay." Whitaker leaned forward, his face reening. He was a man of 60 with thinning white hair and a jawline that suggested he spent his weekends yelling at neighbors about their lawn height. "I don't need a lecture on statutes from a community advocate. I've been on this bench for 20 years. Mr. Plimpton is a respected businessman in this city. If he says the checks didn't arrive, they didn't arrive." "With all due respect, Your Honor," Cynthia replied, her eyes narrowing slightly. "The law doesn't care about Mr. Plimpton's reputation. It cares about the ledger. I have a certified mail receipt showing bang." The sound of the gavel echoed like a gunshot. Silence. "I didn't give you the floor to argue. I gave you the floor to hear my ruling. The motion for a stay is denied. Eviction stands. You have 48 hours to vacate the premises." Cassie let out a small choked sob. Cynthia placed a steadying hand on the younger woman's shoulder. She looked back up at Whitaker, her voice dropping an octave, becoming colder, sharper. "Your Honor, this ruling is in direct violation of the state Supreme Court's ruling in Davis v. Thompson. You are committing a reversible error that will cause irreparable harm to a family. I move for an immediate stay, pending an interlocutory appeal." Whitaker's eyes bulged. No one spoke to him like that. Certainly not a woman who looked like she just walked in off the street. To him, Cynthia Sterling looked like a nobody. She wasn't wearing a $3,000 suit. She didn't have a retinue of clerks. She was just a black woman standing up for a poor girl. "You want to talk about the Supreme Court?" Whitaker hissed. "How about we talk about the decorum of this court? You are out of order. You are disrespectful, and quite frankly, I don't think you have the intellectual capacity to understand the nuances of my rulings." A gasp rippled through the gallery. It was a blatant insult, one that bordered on a judicial ethics violation, but Whitaker felt untouchable. He was golfing buddies with the governor. He was the law and order face of the county. "I am asking for the law to be followed, Judge Whitaker," Cynthia said, her voice echoing in the sudden silence. "If that is disrespectful in your chambers, then perhaps the issue isn't my conduct but your temperament." Whitaker's knuckles turned white as he gripped his gavel. "That's it. I've had enough of your arrogance. I find you in summary contempt of court. You are fined $5,000 payable immediately to the clerk, and if you utter one more word, you'll be spending the night in a holding cell. Bailiff, remove this woman from my sight." Cynthia didn't flinch. She didn't cry. She didn't beg. She slowly reached into her leather portfolio and pulled out a small gold-embossed card. She didn't hand it to the bailiff. She held it up just high enough for the court reporter to see it. "I'll pay the fine, Your Honor," Cynthia said, a terrifyingly calm smile spreading across her face. "But I would suggest you keep the receipt. You're going to need it when the Judicial Qualifications Commission asks for your side of the story." Whitaker laughed, a harsh grating sound. "The commission? I am the commission in this town. Get her out of here." As the bailiff approached, Cynthia turned to the court reporter, Beverly Jensen, a woman she had known for years. "Beverly, make sure you get every word of that last exchange on the record, especially the part about my intellectual capacity. I want the transcript on my desk by 2:00 p.m. "Yes, President Sterling," Beverly replied, her voice trembling slightly with a mix of fear and excitement. The courtroom went dead silent. The name Sterling hung in the air like a guillotine blade. Whitaker froze, his gavel halfway to the block for the next case. "What did you just call her?" Whitaker whispered, the color suddenly draining from his face. Cynthia Sterling didn't wait for the answer. She turned her back on the bench, her heels clicking rhythmically against the marble floor as she led the sobbing Cassie Reed out of the room. She didn't look back at the man whose career had just begun its final rapid descent. The war had started, and Judge Preston Whitaker had brought a gavel to a nuclear strike. The heavy oak doors of Judge Preston Whitaker's private chambers slammed shut with a force that rattled the framed diplomas on his wall. He didn't sit. He paced. The adrenaline that had fueled his outburst in the courtroom was curdling into something cold and acidic in his stomach. "Brian," he roared. His law clerk, Brian Fletcher, a young man whose Ivy League degree hadn't prepared him for the volatility of a small-town tyrant, scurried into the room. Brian was holding a tablet, his hands visibly shaking. "Tell me Beverly was joking," Whitaker spat, pointing a trembling finger towards the courtroom. "Tell me that woman isn't who she said she was." Brian didn't speak. He simply turned the tablet around. There, on the official website of the State Bar Association, was a high-resolution professional portrait. Cynthia Sterling looked back at them with the same calm, piercing gaze she had used in the courtroom. Below the photo in bold, elegant lettering read, "Cynthia Sterling, Esquire, President-elect and Chairperson of the Judicial Oversight Committee." Whitaker sank into his leather chair, the air escaping his lungs in a long, pathetic hiss. "Chairperson of the Oversight Committee," he whispered, "the very group that handles disciplinary recommendations." "Sir," Brian said, his voice barely audible, "she wasn't just there for the eviction case. I did some digging. She's been doing a courtroom observation tour for the last month. She's been visiting several counties incognito to assess judicial temperament and adherence to procedural equity. We weren't on the official list, but apparently she added us this morning." Whitaker felt a bead of sweat roll down his temple. He had just called the woman who could effectively end his career intellectually incapable. He had fined her $5,000 for quoting a Supreme Court president that he honestly hadn't bothered to read in years. "Fix it," Whitaker commanded, regaining a shred of his usual bluster. "Call the clerk's office. Tell them the fine was a clerical error. Strike it from the record. Tell them I was testing her. Yes, a stress test for a high-profile attorney. It was a joke." "It's too late, Your Honor," Brian said, looking like he wanted to vanish through the floorboards. "The transcript has already been logged, and then you should look out your window." Whitaker stood up and moved to the window overlooking the courthouse plaza. His heart skipped a beat. A black sedan had pulled up to the curb, and a small crowd had already gathered. Cynthia Sterling was standing there, but she wasn't alone. She was talking to a woman Whitaker recognized all too well. Lydia Grant, the lead investigative reporter for the Hamilton Daily Chronicle. Beside them, Aura was carrying a heavy, oversized briefcase towards the courthouse entrance. Cynthia Sterling walked back into the courthouse lobby 10 minutes later. She didn't head for the courtroom. She headed for the clerk of court's payment window. The clerk behind the glass, a woman named Brenda Hicks, looked up and froze. She had already heard the rumors flying through the building via the internal messaging system. The nobody who had been fined by Whitaker was actually the most powerful lawyer in the state. "I'm here to pay a debt," Cynthia said, her voice carrying across the lobby. "Miss Sterling, "I mean, President Sterling," Brenda stammered. "The judge's office just called. They said there was a mistake. They're rescinding the fine." "The judge doesn't get to decide that now," Cynthia replied firmly. "The order was given in open court. It's on the record. If I don't pay it, I'm in violation of a judicial order, and I never violate the law, Brenda." "Even when the law is being twisted by a man who thinks he's above it," Cynthia signaled to the courier. He stepped forward and hoisted the heavy briefcase onto the counter. He clicked the latches open. Inside were thousands of coins, nickels, dimes, and pennies, all loose and shimmering. $5,000, Cynthia stated. "In legal tender. It's going to take a while to count, so I suggest you get started. I'll need a formal receipt for the bar's accounting department. We're listing this under evidence of judicial misconduct expenses." As Brenda stared in horror at the mountain of change, a flash went off. Lydia Grant was there, with a photographer capturing the image of the bar president paying a ridiculous fine in the most inconvenient way possible. "Miss Sterling," Lydia called out, "do you have a comment on Judge Whitaker's remarks regarding your intellectual capacity?" Cynthia turned to the camera, her expression one of regal disappointment. "I am less concerned about the personal insults directed at me and more concerned about the thousands of citizens who walk into that courtroom without the protection of my title. If Judge Whitaker treats the president of the bar this way, how does he treat the single mother? How does he treat the veteran? How does he treat the person who can't afford a lawyer?" She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. "Today, Judge Whitaker showed us that he doesn't see people. He sees targets. And the Bar Association has a very specific way of dealing with judges who forget that their robes are a garment of service, not a cloak of immunity." Cynthia's phone chirped. It was a message from her office. The hard karma was already moving faster than she had expected. "Lydia," Cynthia said, looking back at the reporter, "you might want to check the docket for the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals. I just filed an emergency writ of mandamus. Not only am I challenging the fine, but I'm challenging every single eviction order Whitaker has signed in the last 6 months based on his failure to follow the state's rental assistance statutes." The lobby went silent. If that writ was granted, Whitaker wouldn't just be in trouble with the bar. He would be responsible for a legal catastrophe that would cost the county millions and bring his respected businessman friends like Gregory Plimpton crashing down with him. "This isn't a spat, Lydia," Cynthia whispered loud enough for the gathering crowd to hear. "This is a reckoning." By 3:00 p.m., the Hamilton County Courthouse was a beehive of panic. Judge Whitaker's friends were starting to distance themselves. Gregory Plimpton, the landlord who had started this mess, was currently in Whitaker's chambers screaming. "You told me this was a slam dunk, Preston," Plimpton yelled, pacing the rug. "You said you'd get that girl out of my building by Thursday so I could start the renovations for the new luxury condos. Now I've got reporters at my front door asking about predatory practices and statutory violations. Do you have any idea what this does to my financing?" Whitaker looked like he had aged 10 years in 5 hours. "I didn't know she was Sterling. She looked like a pro bono hack." "You're a fool," Plimpton hissed. "You let your ego get in the way of the business. If she digs into my books because of this emergency writ, we're both finished. You remember that contribution I made to your re-election campaign last year, the one that went through the shell company. If she finds that, we aren't just losing our jobs, we're going to prison." Whitaker's heart hammered against his ribs. The contribution. It was $50,000 disguised as a consultancy fee for a legal seminar that never happened. It was the lever Plimpton used to ensure his eviction cases always landed in Whitaker's court. "She won't find it," Whitaker said, though his voice lacked conviction. "The bar only handles ethics. They don't have subpoena power for bank records." "No," Plimpton said, his eyes cold. "But the FBI does, and Cynthia Sterling's husband, he's the assistant regional director of the Bureau's white-collar crime division. You didn't just kick a hornet's nest, Preston. You jumped into the center of a volcano." Whitaker collapsed into his chair. He looked at the gavel on his desk, the tool he had used to bully and break people for 2 decades. It looked small now, pathetic. Suddenly there was a firm knock on the door. It wasn't Brian the Clerk. It was the chief judge of the circuit, Randall Vance. No, wait. Randall Sterling's colleague, Chief Judge Bennett. Bennett walked in without an invitation. He didn't look at Plimpton, he looked straight at Whitaker. "Preston," Bennett said, his voice like dry parchment. "Hand me your keys and your security badge." "Randall, wait, it's over," Bennett said. "The state Supreme Court just issued an administrative order. You are suspended effective immediately, pending a full investigation into your conduct and your financial ties to certain litigants. The sheriff's deputies are outside to escort Mr. Plimpton to an interview room. And you're going home. If I were you, I'd spend the evening finding a very, very good lawyer. Though considering you've insulted the entire Bar Association, you might find that difficult." As Whitaker was led out of the side entrance of the courthouse, ducking his head to avoid the cameras, he saw Cassie Reed, the woman he had tried to throw onto the street. She was standing with Cynthia Sterling. Cynthia wasn't looking at the cameras. She was handing Cassie a set of keys. "What is this?" Cassie asked, tears streaming down her face. "It's a new apartment," Cynthia said softly, "in a building owned by a cooperative that actually follows the law. And don't worry about the rent for the first year. It's been covered by a contempt fine that a certain judge was kind enough to provide." Cynthia looked up then, her eyes meeting Whitaker's as he was shoved into the back of a car. She didn't gloat. She didn't wave. She simply adjusted her blazer, turned her back, and walked toward the future she had secured, not just for herself, but for justice. The hearing room of the Judicial Qualifications Commission, JQC, was a stark contrast to the wood-paneled cathedral-like atmosphere of Courtroom 4B. This room was small, clinical, and brightly lit with humbless LED panels. There was no elevated bench here. There were no ropes. Preston Whitaker sat at a simple folding table looking smaller than he ever had. He wore a gray suit that suddenly seemed too large for his frame. Beside him sat his lawyer, Silas Vane, a man known for defending the indefensible in high-stakes political scandals. Vane was currently looking at his phone, his expression one of deep boredom, a bad sign for any client. Across from them sat the panel, 3 judges from neighboring counties and 2 lay persons. In the center sat Justice Evelyn Thorne. No, wait, I must avoid that name. Let's go with Justice Martha Sterling. No, too close to Cynthia. Let's go with Justice Beatrice Sterling. Still too close. Let's use Justice Helena. Wait, Alina and Alara are banned. Let's use Justice Beatrice Montgomery. Mr. Whitaker, Justice Montgomery began, her voice devoid of the theatricality Preston usually employed. "This is a preliminary disciplinary hearing. We are here to review the transcript from Tuesday's proceedings and the subsequent allegations of financial impropriety. I have already admitted the temperament issue was an error in judgment," Preston said, his voice cracking. "I was under a great deal of stress. My wife has been ill, and your wife was seen at a spa in Scottsdale on Tuesday." Preston, Justice Montgomery interrupted, not even looking up from her notes. "Let's not add perjury to the list. We've reviewed the audio. Your comments regarding Miss Sterling's intellectual capacity weren't a lapse in judgment. They were a window into a pattern of behavior." At that moment, the doors at the back of the room opened. Cynthia Sterling walked in. She wasn't there to testify, not yet. She was there as the president of the bar, exercising her right to observe the proceedings. She sat in the front row, crossed her legs, and pulled out a notebook. She didn't look at Preston. She didn't have to. Her presence was a suffocating weight in the room. "We have a witness who has asked to be heard," the commission's counsel stated. Preston turned, expecting a disgruntled litigant. Instead, his heart dropped into his stomach. Brian Fletcher, his former law clerk, stepped up to the microphone. Brian looked like he hadn't slept in 3 days. "I've been the clerk for Judge Whitaker for 18 months, Brian began, his voice shaking but gaining strength. "During that time, I was instructed to flag any cases involving Gregory Plimpton's properties. I was told to ensure they were always heard on Tuesday mornings regardless of the standard rotation." "And why was that, Mr. Fletcher?" Justice Montgomery asked. "Because the judge told me that Mr. Plimpton was a patriot of the county who shouldn't be hustled by bureaucratic red tape. But I also saw the envelopes, Your Honor." A collective breath was held in the room. "Envelopes in the judge's private bathroom," Brian continued. "Behind the paneling under the sink, I found them while looking for a leak. Cash, bundles of it, and ledger notes that matched the dates of specific eviction rulings." Preston jumped up, his face purple. "He's lying." This is a disgruntled employee. I fired him for incompetence. Bang. This time the sound of the gavel didn't come from Preston. It came from the panel. Sit down, Mr. Whitaker. Justice Montgomery said, her voice like ice. You no longer hold the gavel. You are a subject of an investigation. And based on the search warrant executed by the State Bureau of Investigation 2 hours ago at your residence, it seems Mr. Fletcher's testimony is redundant. Preston's knees gave out. He slumped back into his chair. The hard karma wasn't just a loss of a job. It was the total eraser of a legacy. Cynthia Sterling leaned forward then, finally making eye contact with the man who had tried to humiliate her. She didn't look angry. She looked curious, as if she was studying a strange, dying insect. I have one question for the record, Cynthia said, her voice melodious and terrifyingly calm. Mr. Whitaker, when you looked at me on Tuesday, did you see a lawyer, or did you just see a shadow you thought you could step on without feeling the ground? Preston couldn't answer. He looked down at his hands. They were shaking. The tragedy isn't what you did to me, Cynthia continued, standing up to leave. The tragedy is that you forgot that every person who enters your courtroom is a human being. You treated justice like a retail transaction, and now the bill has come due. And unlike my fine, you can't pay this one in coins. As she walked out, the reporters in the hallway swarmed. But Cynthia didn't stop for them. She had a more important meeting. She was going to the hospital to see Cassie Reed's daughter. The stress of the eviction had landed the child in the respiratory ward. Cynthia was bringing the news that the eviction had been overturned. The landlord was in custody, and the medical bills were being handled by a new fund she had established, the Sterling Justice Foundation. The story of the judge who met his match was already the top trending video on every platform. But for Cynthia, the viral fame was just a tool. The real work was in the silence of the hospital room, proving that the law could heal just as easily as it could hurt. The investigation into the fall of Preston Whitaker didn't happen in the hushed, polite tones of a courtroom. It happened in the cold, blue light of computer monitors and the frantic shuffling of seizing documents during dawn raids. While the public was still reeling from the viral video of Cynthia Sterling paying a $5,000 fine in nickels and pennies, a much more dangerous machine was grinding into gear. The paper trail began at the Hamilton County Administrative Annex, where Clara Montgomery, the lead investigator for the State Bureau of Investigation, stood over a shredder that had jammed. It was a small, poetic irony. The very machine meant to hide Whitaker's sins had choked on the sheer volume of his greed. He was sloppy, Clara remarked, pulling a tangled mess of half-shredded bank statements from the machine. He thought he was untouchable for so long that he forgot the first rule of corruption: never keep the receipts. At 6:00 a.m. on a Friday, the quiet gated community of Pinerist was woken by the rhythmic thud of a battering ram. The FBI, led by David Sterling, didn't just knock. They arrived with the weight of a federal warrant that covered everything from the floorboards to the cloud servers. David Sterling was a man of quiet intensity, a stark contrast to his wife Cynthia's public F-facing fire. While Cynthia was the shield, David was the scalpel. He walked through Whitaker's opulent foyer, past the gold-leafed mirrors and the marble statues of Greek philosophers, looking for the one thing he knew a man like Whitaker couldn't live without: control. Check the library. David commanded his team. Men like this always want to be surrounded by their own importance. They found it behind a massive oil painting of a blindfolded Lady Justice, a painting Whitaker had ironically commissioned to hang over his wet bar. Behind the canvas was a modern biometric safe. It didn't take long for the digital forensics team to bypass the locks. Inside wasn't just cash, though. There were stacks of $100 bills totaling nearly $400,000. There was a series of black leather-bound ledgers. This was Project Legacy. While David was dismantling Whitaker's home, Clara Montgomery was in a stark interrogation room with Gregory Plimpton, the landlord who had started the fire. Plimpton, usually a man of expensive silk ties and booming confidence, looked pathetic in the harsh fluorescent light. He was sweating through his shirt, his hands trembling as he reached for a paper cup of lukewarm water. "You're facing 20 years, Gregory," Clara said, her voice a flat, terrifying monotone. racketeering, bribery of a judicial officer, tax evasion, and civil rights violations. And that's just the morning list. By the time we finish auditing your Hamilton development group, we'll probably find enough to keep you away until the turn of the next century. Plimpton looked up, his eyes darting towards the two-way mirror. I was just doing business. Everyone does it. You want to get things built in this county, you have to grease the wheels. Whitaker was the wheel. You weren't greasing wheels, Gregory. You were buying a pet, Clara countered. You paid him to ensure your evictions were processed within 48 hours, bypassing the mandatory waiting periods. You paid him to look the other way on building code violations that resulted in the respiratory issues of 3 children in your apartment block. You didn't just pay for favor. You paid for the right to be a monster. Plimpton broke. The hard karma hit him like a physical blow when Clara slid a document across the table. It was a freeze order. As of 20 minutes ago, every asset associated with your name, your shell companies, and your trust funds has been seized under the RICO Act. Clara said, "You aren't a billionaire anymore, Gregory. You're a ward of the state. Your wife's accounts are frozen. Your kids' college funds are gone. The only thing you have left to bargain with is Preston Whitaker." Plimpton stared at the paper, his jaw working silently. The realization that his empire had vanished because he tried to bully a woman in a charcoal blazer was a bitter pill he couldn't swallow. "The ledger," Plimpton whispered. "He has a ledger. Every cent I gave him is in there. He kept it because he didn't trust me. He wanted leverage in case I ever stopped paying." Back at the FBI field office, David Sterling was leafing through the Project Legacy ledgers. It wasn't just a list of bribes. It was a map of a shadow government. Whitaker had been keeping tabs on everyone. He had records of which police officers took gratuities to lose evidence, which city council members had secret gambling debts, and which lawyers were willing to throw cases for a kickback. But as David reached the back of the third ledger, he stopped. He saw a name that made the blood in his veins turn to ice. Caleb Sterling. David pulled out his phone and called Cynthia immediately. "Cynthia, you need to come down to the office now." When Cynthia arrived, she was still in her courtroom attire, having just finished a meeting with the Board of Overseers. She walked into the digital forensic lab where David was waiting. He didn't say a word. He just pointed to a file on the screen. It was a property dispute case from 2011. Caleb Sterling, Cynthia's favorite uncle, the man who had put her through law school after her father passed, had owned a small, thriving construction company. He had been sued by a rival developer over a land use permit. The case had landed in Whitaker's court. Cynthia scanned the notes. Whitaker had ruled against her uncle, citing a clerical error in the deed that didn't exist. He had then hit the company with punitive sanctions that were so high they forced Caleb into bankruptcy. He lost his business, his home, and eventually his health. He died of a stress-induced heart attack 2 years later, thinking he had failed his family. Below the case summary was a handwritten note in Whitaker's cramped, precise script. HDG, Hamilton Development Group, paid $50K for the ruling. Sterling was too stubborn to settle, needed to make an example of him so the other small firms fall in line. Easy win. Cynthia sank into a chair, the air leaving her lungs in a jagged gasp. For years she had carried the grief of her uncle's failure, always wondering why a man so meticulous had made such a supposed mess of his business. "He didn't lose," Cynthia whispered, her eyes filling with a cold, terrifying light. "He was robbed. Whitaker murdered him. He murdered a lot of people's dreams, Cynthia," David said softly, kneeling beside her. "But he didn't count on one thing. He didn't count on the niece of Caleb Sterling becoming the woman who would finally open his safe. The karma didn't stop with the criminal charges. The hard karma of the paper trail began to manifest in the real world as the Sterling Justice Foundation was formed. Because Whitaker had kept such detailed records of his bribes, the investigators were able to trace the money back to the original victims. The Project Legacy Ledger became a road map for restitution. Asterisk the landlord's fate. Gregory Plimpton, realizing he was the canary in the coal mine, attempted to flee the country on a private jet. He was intercepted on the tarmac at Hamilton International Airport, the very airport where Whitaker used to receive VIP treatment. His jet was seized, his mansions were put up for auction, and every penny was redirected into a fund for the tenants he had illegally evicted. Risk, the silent partners. 3 other judges whose names appeared in the Black Book resigned within 48 hours. They knew the paper trail was coming for them next. The local political machine, which had functioned on favors for decades, ground to a halt as bank after bank began closing the accounts of anyone associated with Whitaker to avoid federal know-your-customer violations. The town of Hamilton was transformed. The courthouse, once a place where people walked with their heads down, hoping not to be noticed by the king of the bench, became a site of pilgrimage. People began leaving flowers and notes on the steps, not for Whitaker, but for the victims like Caleb Sterling and Derek Walsh. The media coverage was relentless. Lydia Grant of the Chronicle ran a front-page expose every day for a week detailing a different Project Legacy victim. The story of the bar president and the bully judge had become a national obsession, but for the people of Hamilton, it was personal. They were seeing the man who had played God with their lives being led into a preliminary hearing in a standard-issue jumpsuit, his hands cuffed to a chain around his waist. Whitaker's defense team, led by Silas Vane, tried to file a motion to suppress the Project Legacy ledgers, arguing they were private journals protected by the Fourth Amendment. The hearing for the motion took place in a courtroom packed with the very people Whitaker had disenfranchised. Cynthia Sterling sat in the front row, her eyes never leaving Whitaker's face. The presiding judge for the pre-trial motions, Justice Beatrice Montgomery, didn't even wait for Silas Vane to finish his argument. "Mr. Vane," Justice Montgomery interrupted, her voice echoing with the authority Whitaker had once abused. "The Fourth Amendment protects citizens from unreasonable searches. There is nothing unreasonable about seizing a ledger that documents the systematic destruction of the judicial system. Your client didn't write poetry in these books. He wrote a price list for the law. The motion is denied. These ledgers will be the centerpiece of the prosecution's case." Whitaker looked over at Cynthia. Then, for the first time, the arrogance was gone. He looked at her and saw not just a lawyer, not just the bar president, but the living embodiment of every person he had ever cheated. He saw the face of the hard karma he had spent 20 years inviting into his life. As Part 6 drew to a close, the investigation had reached its peak. The paper trail of greed was no longer a trail. It was a noose. David Sterling's team had connected the final dots between Whitaker's offshore accounts and the consultancy fees paid by Plimpton. Cynthia stood in her office on the eve of the criminal trial, looking at a framed photo of her Uncle Caleb. She remembered the day he had told her that the truth is like a river. You can dam it up for a while, but eventually it's going to find the sea. "We're almost there, Uncle," she whispered. The paper trail was complete. The evidence was overwhelming. The hard karma had dismantled the lives of the predators, leaving them with nothing but the silence of their cells and the weight of their own records. Now all that remained was the final sentencing, the moment where the world would see that while a judge may hold the gavel, it is the truth that holds the power. The morning of the sentencing of Preston Whitaker didn't feel like a typical day at the Hamilton County Courthouse. Usually the air was thick with the mundane, the rustle of papers, the low drone of traffic outside, and the indifferent shuffling of feet. But today the silence was heavy, almost sacred. It was the kind of silence that precedes a storm or an execution. Outside, the limestone steps were teeming with people. This wasn't just a local news story anymore. It had become a national symbol of the Sterling reckoning. People held signs that read, "Justice for the unheard, and the gavel is not a weapon." In the center of the crowd stood Cassie Reed, the young mother who had been the catalyst for this entire collapse. She wasn't crying today. She stood with her shoulders back, wearing a simple blue dress, looking up at the building that had once been a fortress of fear for her. Inside Courtroom 1A, the largest in the building, every seat was taken. The gallery was a sea of contrasts. On one side sat the legal elite of the state, members of the Bar Association who had come to witness the final fall of one of their own. On the other side sat the people Whitaker had stepped on during his 20-year reign, the evicted, the unfairly sentenced, and the families of those whose lives had been ruined by his Project Legacy ledger. At the defense table, Preston Whitaker looked like a ghost of the man who had sat on the bench just months prior. He wore an orange jumpsuit, his once manicured hands now cuffed at the wrists. Gone was the expensive silk tie and the tailored wool suit. Without the robe, he looked remarkably small, a frail, aging man with sunken eyes and a trembling lip. Beside him, Silas Vane, his Hypric defense attorney, looked as though he was already mentally halfway to his next case. Vane knew the ship had sunk. He was just there to ensure the drowning was documented. At exactly 10:00 a.m., the bailiff's voice rang out, but it lacked the usual rehearsed boredom. All rise for the Honorable Howard Blackwell. Judge Blackwell entered with a gait that commanded immediate respect. He was a man known for a lack of theatrics, a jurist who believed the law should be as predictable as the sunrise and as firm as the earth. He took his seat, adjusted his spectacles, and looked down at the man who had once been his colleague. "Mr. Whitaker," Blackwell began, his voice deep and resonant. "Before I pass sentence, the court will hear victim impact statements. We will begin with Derek Walsh." A man in a worn military jacket stood up and walked to the podium. He walked with a limp, the result of an injury sustained during his service. 5 years ago, Derek began, his voice steady but thick with emotion. "I stood in your courtroom, Mr. Whitaker. I was fighting a predatory loan that was trying to take my grandfather's farm. I had the paperwork. I had the proof of fraud, but you didn't even look at it. You laughed at me. You told me that patriots pay their debts and ruled in favor of the bank. I lost the farm. My grandfather died 3 months later in a state-run nursing home because he couldn't handle the heartbreak. I found out last week that the bank's CEO was on your consultancy list. You didn't just take my land, sir. You took my family's history for a few thousand in an envelope." The room remained deathly quiet as Derek sat down. One by one, others followed. Abigail Henderson, an 80-year-old woman who had been illegally evicted during a blizzard. Franklin Boyd, a small business owner who had been bankrupted by a frivolous lawsuit Whitaker had allowed to proceed because the plaintiff was a golfing buddy. The final person to step to the podium was Cynthia Sterling. She didn't speak as the president of the bar. She spoke as a citizen. She wore a dark suit, her presence filling the room with a gravity that made Whitaker look away. "Your Honor," Cynthia said, looking directly at Blackwell before turning her gaze to Whitaker. "The law is a fragile thing. It only works because we agree to believe in it. We agree to give up our right to take what we want by force because we trust that the person in the robe will use the truth as their only compass." When Preston Whitaker took that gavel, he didn't just take a job. He took a vow. He broke that vow every single day for 20 years. He didn't just hurt individuals. He wounded the very soul of Hamilton County. He made people believe that justice was something you bought at a window like a ticket to a movie. He made the robe a cloak for his own greed. She paused, the weight of her words settling over the room. "The fine he gave me that day in courtroom 4B was $5,000. He thought that was the price of my silence. He thought that was the price of my dignity. But today we see the real price. The price is his legacy. The price is his freedom. And the price is the restoration of the faith he tried to destroy." When she sat down, there were no cheers, only a collective exhale of breath. Judge Blackwell looked at Whitaker. "Do you have anything to say before I pass sentence?" Whitaker stood up slowly. For a moment, a flash of the old arrogance returned to his eyes. He looked at the gallery, at the people he had spent years looking down upon. "I did what I had to do," Whitaker whispered, his voice gaining volume. "This county was a mess when I took the bench. I brought order. I supported the businesses that kept this town alive. So what if I took a little for myself? I earned it. I spent 20 years listening to the dregs of society complain about their self-inflicted problems. You think Sterling is a hero. She's just a politician in a better suit. You're all hypocrites." Silas Vane physically pulled Whitaker back into his seat, but the damage was done. The hard karma was no longer just a legal certainty. It was a spiritual one. Whitaker had revealed himself to be a man utterly devoid of remorse. Judge Blackwell didn't even blink. He picked up a thick stack of papers, the final report from the FBI and the State Bureau of Investigation. "Mr. Whitaker," Blackwell said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. "Your lack of contrition is staggering. You speak of order, but you were the author of chaos. You speak of supporting business, but you are nothing more than a common extortionist with a government-issued parking spot. The investigation into your black book has already led to the resignation of 4 city council members and the indictment of 12 local developers, including your friend Gregory Plimpton. You didn't protect this county. You bled it dry." Blackwell leaned forward, his eyes locking onto Ouida's. "The law provides for a maximum sentence. And in cases of such profound breach of public trust, it is the court's duty to ensure that the punishment reflects the magnitude of the betrayal for the counts of racketeering, bribery, civil rights violations, and money laundering. I sentence you to 25 years in the state penitentiary to be served without the possibility of early release. Furthermore, under the civil forfeit statutes, every asset you own, your estate on Pinterest, your offshore accounts, your vintage car collection is hereby seized. These assets will be liquidated and placed into the Hamilton Restitution Fund, which will be overseen by a committee appointed by the State Bar Association." Whitaker's face went white. "Everything," he gasped. "You're leaving me with nothing. You left Derek Walsh with nothing," Blackwell replied coldly. "You left Abigail Henderson in the snow. You are merely receiving the harvest of the seeds you sowed. Balaf, remove the prisoner." As the handcuffs were tightened, Whitaker began to scream. It wasn't a scream of defiance, but the high, thin wail of a man who realized the world he had built had finally collapsed on top of him. He was led through the side door, the heavy steel clanging shut behind him. The courtroom began to clear, but Cynthia Sterling stayed in her seat. She watched as the court reporter, Beverly Jensen, packed up her machine. Beverly looked at Cynthia and gave a small, respectful nod. The record was closed. The truth was preserved. Outside on the courthouse steps, the sun had finally broken through the clouds. Cynthia walked out and the crowd fell silent. Lydia Grant from the Chronicle stepped forward with a microphone. "Miss Sterling, after everything that's happened, the threats, the investigation, the trial, was it worth it for a $5,000 fine?" Cynthia looked at the crowd, her eyes finding Cassie Reed. She smiled. A genuine, tired but triumphant smile. "It was never about the $5,000, Lydia," Cynthia said, her voice clear and carrying across the plaza. "It was about the fact that in this country, the smallest person in the room has the exact same rights as the most powerful person on the bench. Today, we proved that the law doesn't belong to the judges. It belongs to the people." As she walked toward her car, a man stepped out of the crowd. It was Derek Walsh. He didn't say anything at first. He just reached into his pocket and pulled out a small tarnished silver coin, a challenge coin from his unit. He pressed it into Cynthia's hand. "My grandfather used to say that some people are born to carry the light," Derek whispered. "Thank you for bringing the light back to Hamilton, Miss Sterling." Cynthia gripped the coin tight. She watched as the crowd began to disperse, people talking to one another, some crying, some laughing. The black woman Whitaker had tried to bury had instead become the cornerstone of a new era. The hard karma of Preston Whitaker was a story that would be told for generations in the halls of the state capitol, a warning to those who would trade their integrity for power. But for Cynthia, it was simply the end of a very long Tuesday. She got into her car, adjusted her rear-view mirror, and drove away from the courthouse, leaving the ghosts of the past behind and driving toward a future where justice was no longer a transaction, but a promise. The fall of Preston Whitaker wasn't just a legal victory. It was a moral reckoning that reshaped the landscape of Hamilton County forever. When he tried to humiliate Cynthia Sterling, he didn't realize he was handing her the shovel she would use to dig up his darkest secrets. This story is a testament to the fact that arrogance is a brittle shield, and when it shatters, it leaves nothing behind but the cold, hard truth. The victims who stood in that courtroom finally reclaimed their voices, proving that no one is truly nobodied in the eyes of the law, when someone has the courage to stand up. If you are moved by this final chapter of justice and the incredible power of integrity, please hit that like button and share this video with someone who needs to hear that the truth always wins. This is the kind of real-life karma that reminds us all why the fight for justice is worth it. Subscribe to our channel and click the bell icon so you never miss another deep dive into stories of courage and accountability. What was the most satisfying moment of Whitaker's sentencing for you? Let us know in the comments. We love hearing your thoughts. Thank you for being part of this journey. Keep standing for what's right, and we'll see you in the next.